Okay, we'll get started. So this is the name of this talk is Pearls and Pitfalls in Trainee-Led Research. This is a RAMS and SAEM Research Committee sponsored event. I'm Nehal Naik. I'm a first year at GW in DC. I'm also the RAMS president.
I'm Josh Davis. I'm a second year resident at Penn State, Hershey.
I'm Josh Joseph. I'm Director of Operations Research for Beth Israel Deaconess, and I'm kind of our faculty discussant, if you could call me that.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Carter, fourth year medical student at Virginia Commonwealth University.
Okay, we don't have any disclosures. The objectives of this discussion will be to, one, at the end of this session, to describe essential factors for planning a successful trainee research program, or at least try. Next, identify the tools for training to seek out effective mentorship relationships. And the last one is to better predict a successful, and this is more for our faculty, better predict a successful trainee-led research project. So first we're going to start on how to be a good mentee. There's a few studies out there, especially there's a big guide by the AAMC that was done through internal medicine on how to be a good mentee. One of the biggest things is being realistic, especially if you're a resident, you're not a postdoc. So your primary responsibility is clinical duties. So being realistic about the time commitment that you have into doing research is the primary thing. The next thing is setting up an idea of what you want to do. One of the things, I don't have it up here because we wanted to decrease the amount of just verbiage on slides because he wants to read slides. Is what do you look for in a mentor, and how do you set that up? What we suggest, and what's kind of worked with some people, is to first figure out what are your research interests, what's worked in the past for you, and then find a mentor whose own research interests align with yours. Hopefully within your department, but not necessarily so. The next thing is to obviously reach out to those mentors, but being realistic on their time requirements as well. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of the details of research, but understanding maybe what the research background you have, if you have a lot of methodological training, or if you don't have a methodological training, do you have a mentor that can help you along the way for each of these topics, big topics in research? And one of the big things about being a mentee is being a little more open on where your mentor can come from. Sometimes they may be in your Department of Emergency Medicine. Sometimes it may be outside the Department of Medicine or the House of Medicine entirely, especially if it's methodologic. Our PhD colleagues obviously know that there's great teaching that they learn in their first years of PhDs, learning about methodology, or it could be a public health school if it's in your neighborhood. So we wanted to make this a little interactive, and first ask any of you who's available on what's worked in the past on finding a good mentor as a mentee.
I'm going to run the mic around to whoever wants to talk about that.
So in the past, my name is Chris. I've looked for people who have a track record of mentoring students and people who are at my level of training as well, so that I knew it worked well for other people.
Right. And so one of the things we actually that's perfect thing to bring up is that, you may have people in your department who are phenomenal researchers, but they may not be necessarily the ones who are greatest mentors to residents because it's just not potentially part of their interests or part of their breadth of work. Try to look for mentors who really have a successful track record in finding, in helping trainees. And I did want to transition this to our faculty mentor here because he's got a good track record in doing so.
Okay, so to echo a point that was just made earlier, being realistic. What do you mean realistic? Primarily what I'm looking for when I'm working with a resident or even with a student is something that is an achievable goal within the time frame that you have. I think all of us have questions, all of us have things that we want to change about our clinical practice, but realistically speaking, as a resident, you have extremely little time to yourself. And oftentimes, you're not, especially within intern or second year, going to be starting your own study. maybe a chart review, but for the most part, you're going to be jumping onto something that is either already in the planning stages or already underway. And part of this is because, you really don't have the time bandwidth to start unless you've had some significant research training beforehand. Again, if you have a PhD coming into residency, if you have an MPH and you have kind of a set frame of research that you've already been doing, that's sometimes possible to keep up, but it's fairly rare. One of the big things, and it's kind of ironic to be discussing this at a national conference, is to try and set actually a pretty low bar in terms of what the next goal you're going to do with your research. There are a lot of opportunities at the regional level, whether it's at SAEM, AEM, or ACEP, to actually see what projects are ongoing and to present kind of your first draft of your research. So very commonly, that is also the time when you're going to be looking at pitching your work for awards to actually get you either the time or the resources to be able to carry out a more meaningful study. And in terms of who I deal with between resident students and fellows, the kind of red flags that I look out for, not because I think people are being disingenuous, but they're not necessarily being realistic, are when people are trying to commit to multiple research projects at once. It's very hard, especially when you're starting out. You're introduced to often a lot of hopefully very interesting faculty members and also a lot of interesting projects that may be going on in your department, but you really have to be able to say, look, I'm going to give this project a try. I'm going to see it from start to finish in terms of my role as a resident. When somebody basically says, oh, hey, I really think that operations project you're doing is cool. I'm also working on this ultrasound project. There's a part of me that definitely empathizes with that interest, but realistically, what that at best is going to be is that one of those projects is going to get done, and maybe eventually the other one will be done before the person finishes residency. Realistically, it's really hard to build off of multiple projects at once, again, unless you're doing only kind of a small part of that. So somebody who maybe does stats already, yeah, you can meaningfully contribute to multiple projects, but it's very hard to see those through. And in terms of actually building your career and building that mentor-mentee relationship, it's very hard to then say, okay, what are the next steps going to be if those next steps are, I have to finish my work on the other project? Go for it.
So you briefly mentioned awards and like local conferences. Could you talk a little bit about like where you could find like those types of things? And then what are we doing it just to like build our CV, or is there something like what are we trying to get out of these awards?
Sure. So there are a couple of things. One, yeah, building your CV is pretty important. And that, again, that's going to be a longitudinal process. But very commonly, you're building a couple of different things when you go to a local conference. One is you're introducing yourself to a lot of people who may be in your area who can have both meaningful relationships in terms of when you graduate residency, when you go into fellowship, but also you're really getting kind of a first draft of your research across. Again, for a lot of people, I think my first experience actually was presenting at a national conference, and my first abstract, I had tons of questions that I was completely unprepared for. And by comparison, later in residency, when I actually did have the time and the opportunity to present at regional SAM, I actually got asked some of those questions in a much less stressful environment that I got asked once again when I presented again at national. So that's one aspect of it. Two is just there are a lot of opportunities. Again, as a resident, having a couple of $1,000s, which you can get from some of these awards, in the scheme of research funding, NIH is generally not handing out $2,000 awards. But for you as a resident, being able to, afford a new laptop, being able to get that statistics software, being able potentially, in terms of time, to be able to pay a research assistant to do 20 hours worth of sorting through Excel spreadsheets actually can mean the difference between you being able to do your project and not. Helpful?
One thing I just wanted to add was, one thing I wanted to ask Dr. Joseph is, what do you think, as a mentor, for the people who are mentors out there, what do you think you're looking for? What works for you as a mentor when you're looking at training-led research?
Sure. So I think one of the things that I really am trying to look for is somebody who I can build a relationship with. And I don't mean that necessarily in a touchy-feely kind of way, but realistically, every time I work with a learner on some level, that's a major investment in terms of time. It's fairly rare, with, again, a couple of very small exceptions, where getting somebody involved in a research project is super beneficial to me as a researcher. And I'm not saying that to be pejorative, but in all honesty, to bring somebody some of those skills to really kind of refine their work, that's a major investment. And what I would like to see is for that person to basically build on the experience, learn from it, and then require, as we go forward, less and less contribution from my end, and the kind of nature of that contribution changing significantly. Again, when it comes down to putting forward an abstract, submitting a manuscript, again, if I'm doing this myself, I have a fair amount of experience. I'm not, a master scholar by any means, but it doesn't take me that much time. Whereas, again, trying to help somebody to see where they're not necessarily making that connection or how they might need to refine their work is a major investment. But again, I really want to say, we're starting on this research project. Where do you see this research project going? What do you want to change when you do your version of this? And how do I kind of push you forward beyond it? So again, I think a lot of times I'll work with a student, I'll work with a resident, and it will be a one and done kind of project. And sometimes that can still be a good experience. But for the most part, I'm really looking to build up somebody who is eventually going to be either my colleague or collaborator down the line.
There is one quick question I want to briefly add. Are there any mentors out there who want to say what might have worked for them in the past?
Sure, no problem. Arthur J. I'm over in Sacramento. So Felix Sankel is, we all love Felix. He's Felix. And he has one of my favorite lectures of all time. Do you guys know who Felix Sankel is? So it's the concept of separating the mentor, the teacher, and the cheerleader. And there are 3 separate roles, and it's really hard to do all 3 at once. And I personally struggle. Like, I mentor 35 people right now. I mentor 35 people right now, and it's difficult to, separate those 3 roles. And the one that I get stuck on the most is making sure that the true mentor, which takes a person from point A, gets them involved in research, and I struggle getting them through the hump to complete it. So I end up teaming people up, and that works pretty well for me. But my big thing with mentorship is this concept that Felix has, the mentor, teacher, and the cheerleader. They're all different.
So for the last part of this presentation, we just put together a couple pearls and pitfalls, as the title said, that we kind of, between the group of us, had come up with. If at any point during any of these slides you have questions, please raise your hand and ask. There is designed time for you to have questions. You don't have to wait till the end. When the question pops in your head on the topic we're talking about, please just raise your hand and ask about it. So the first thing we talked about was starting early and setting a time commitment, so being realistic with your time goals and starting much, much earlier than you think you need to. So trying to realize that your time is going to be there's going to be delays that you're not going to be expecting, and your time's going to be drained in many directions that you may not be expecting, especially when you start your intern year. Don't dive into a research project and not even know what you're getting your feet into as far as clinical work and time like that. And be mindful of what rotations you're on and stuff like that. The other thing we had talked about was setting goals along the way, so setting goals and setting realistic timelines and goals, and also setting a final goal and working your way back with kind of mini goals, kind of like we do when we're doing strategic planning. So we talked a little bit about the scientific method and methodology. If you are not someone who has experience doing that, find a mentor who can help you with that, or find somebody who can help you with that. So you may have, a librarian who can help you with your background search. You may have a statistician who can help you, figure out what statistics you need. Get them involved early so that you're doing the research right from the beginning versus, coming back later and realizing you have a bunch of junk data that there's nothing that you can necessarily do with. The other thing on the flip side of all of this, research, methodologic rigor is the practicality of what you're doing and what time frame you have to do it in. So if you have a year or 2 years left in your residency to do it, you need to be realistic about that time frame and what you're going to get done in that time frame. And also, there's certain things that, can't, we all want the million patient randomized controlled blinded trial of everything, but like that's not realistic, and there's certain things that you just can't do with that. For example, you can't blind neurointerventional stroke. You can't blind putting a big catheter in someone's brain. You can't randomize someone to placebo for PCI and MI or other things, and we all don't have a million patients available to us or all of the hours in the world. So I want to talk a little bit about funding. So we talked about where to get starting funding, and I think if you have a mentor who already has funding, that's great. But if you can get even $1,000 or $2,000, I've had multiple $1,000 grants, $2,000, $10,000. Those add up, and nobody's going to give you the $1 million grant. I shouldn't say nobody, but people are going to be less likely to give you the $1 million grant unless you can show them that you can adequately manage $1,000 and still get a project done and completed on time with that money. So people are very hesitant in giving out their money because it's a very limited resource in the research world and the world in general, and so being mindful of that.
Just to interject for a quick sec, oftentimes individual foundations, depending on if you have a particular area of interest, if you want to do ultrasound, if you want to do stroke research, there are a ton of student and resident grants where a lot of times you may be the only person applying. This is even more so at the medical school or university level. The number of tiny name grants, they're administered every year that actually go totally unfilled is quite high. So with many of these grants, just the act of applying gets you in the door a lot of the time. So it's really worth it.
If only it were that easy. There's no single database. There are each subgroup will have its own database. So if you go, for example, I'll use ultrasound. If you go to AEUS here, they have databases of grants that are available. If you go to different groups, the stroke interest group, or speaking with a mentor who's known in the field, they may know some different groups and stuff, but there's no clearinghouse. There is there's the one that the national government uses that does put some smaller ones on it as well, but there's not a great one for all these smaller ones that exist. You kind of it's kind of like who you know and being in the right place and keeping your eyes peeled on and networking and stuff, getting into those regional meetings. The other thing, if you are putting grants in and stuff, is working with your grants office. They're not your enemies, despite the fact that they may seem like it. So work with them early, be nice to them. They sometimes are a little bit picky about getting all the things in the right order, but that is what shows on your grant. When you put your grant in, it shows that you listened to all of the instructions. It seems stupid when they tell you to change the font or put a period here or format it the other way. And sometimes I just tell them to do all that stuff. And if you have a nice relationship, that works. But you just want to be mindful that they're just doing it to help you and segueing well into groups that are trying to help you. We'll talk a little bit about the IRB. So, so again, it's another group that, they are really there, for a reason and a cause. A couple tips that we came up with for communicating with the IRB: if you have a research coordinator at your site who frequently communicates with the IRB, utilize them as a resource, whether it's in your department or outside your department. They know who to contact, when the deadlines are, how they want stuff formatted, what are they nitpicky about. The other thing that we had talked about as well is content for the IRB. Keep in mind that their goal is human subjects protection, not research methodology. So you want to give them as much information as they need to get that job done without giving them superfluous information, because that just opens Pandora's box of, oh, well, you said this, and then they have 10 more questions about how you're going to do this and how you're going to do that. If they don't need the info, you don't need to give it to them. And then the other thing as far as human subjects protection and methodologic writing your IRB. There are community members on every single IRB. It's part of the requirements for being on an IRB. So you should write your IRB proposal just like you write your consent in an 8th grade level. I mean, most of the people who are community members are, lawyers and, business people. They are well educated, but not necessarily in the medical field. So you want to avoid jargon and stuff in your IRB submission. And model your consent and your IRB in the same type of language. So we're going to talk a little bit about help and where to get some help from. So this slide is meant to say, send out all your minions to do all your work for you. So I talked a little bit about getting statisticians and librarians involved. There are other people at your institution. So we talked about the IRB, the research coordinators, but then also getting the data done is also important. So we have a undergraduate research volunteer program. That's super helpful. If you have med students who want to be on the research, that's super helpful. One thing I found really helpful in a lot of the projects that I've published in getting med students on board is if you offer them authorship up front and tell them if they meet criteria, they can be an author, they are much more engaged rather than, you know, trying to hold that back or have this like wishy-washy, like, what's going to happen. I tell people up front, like, if you meet criteria to be an author, I will let you be an author, and I find that that goes a long way to getting people more engaged. So now we're going to talk a little bit about writing the manuscript. So I think one of the things that we had talked about in our group was finding people who letting people shine at what they do. So for example, I enjoy and am good at writing primary manuscripts. I hate editing them. I don't like moving stuff around and all that stuff. There are lots of people, I'm rare, there are lots of people who enjoy editing. So you just want to make sure that you have a plan together that emphasizes everybody's best interest. If somebody is really good at statistics, maybe have them write the method section. Or, you know, if somebody, you know, really knows the literature well, have them do the intro and the discussion. Those would be, you know, things to consider. Or have maybe, like I said, have some person who's a really good writer draft everything and then have everyone else edit it afterwards. Those are all kind of acceptable ways to get to authorship. And then the other thing is not to put it off till the end. So a good manuscript, you should probably have your intro and methods written before you have even started collecting data, understanding the background that's out there and the methods that you're going to do. So you should almost have that part already written and maybe just need to update it a little bit. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is talking about submitting. So revise and resubmit is not a failure, that's actually a win. So you will not get, you know, hate to say this, but you are very unlikely to get a straight up accept. The revise and resubmit is a win. And there are also, you know, even if you get a reject, like there are other journals. I think one thing to keep in mind is that you're submitting to a specific audience. So make sure you have that in mind as well. And so if you are submitting to, you know, we use the stroke. So if you're submitting to a neurology journal with a neurology audience, you're going to be writing your manuscript and your discussion very differently than if you're submitting to an emergency medicine audience versus if you're submitting to, you know, a resuscitation audience. So it's just important to realize the audience that you're writing for. So some take-home points from our talk. We want to start early and have a timeline. That's really important. Make sure that you start much earlier than you think that you need to. Find an engaged mentor and trainee and be an engaged mentee. I think I would add on there as well. So make sure that you utilize setting expectations up front and what your time constraints are and what you expect out of like what's going to get done. Sometimes those conversations can be a little bit difficult, but they're important to have up front so that all of the boundaries and guidelines are set up front. Everybody knows what is kind of expected. And then utilize available resources for help. So at your institution, if you have anyone, a coordinator, a statistician, like you don't have to do all the work, right? If somebody else's job is to get paid to do that work, like you can have them do that work. And it will save you a lot of time and aggravation. So. Does anyone have any questions, comments, concerns, opinions, anecdotes, monologues, diatribes?
To chime in just a little bit more here, so I'll kind of share some of my own awkward experiences, kind of making that transition from residency and beyond. So one of the reasons why I kind of harp so much on applying for like really small grants and, you know, starting out at regional conferences is that there really is a successive progression that you should be making with a lot of these projects. One is that when you're submitting an abstract, the majority of the time, at least most of the researchers I know, write their manuscripts from their abstracts. It's really a pretty organic process of just expanding what you already have. And again, kind of doing that initial presentation is going to help you anticipate questions that you're going to get, again, when you present to a larger audience, but also when you actually write the manuscript. Because again, if people are coming up with these questions after you've spoken about your topic for like 5 to 8 minutes, when somebody actually is reviewing for one of these journals and has maybe hours to be kind of going over your manuscript with a fine-tooth comb, admittedly, not all reviewers do that, you really want to be ready for any questions that they might have before you're hitting the revision stage, because again, if you're not answering some of those immediate questions or counter-arguments, you may never get asked to make those revisions in the first place. Another reason why starting small is really important, applying for, say, an NIH grant is a really daunting process. Even if you are in the habit of applying to them, they take a tremendous amount of work. And there are very specific ways in which they want you to present your research. You can present something very clearly, but if you don't really fit the cookie cutter formula about how you pose your specific aims, how you formulate your hypothesis, even if you're getting the point across perfectly well, if you're not presenting it in the kind of format that they're expecting, and again, literally I'm talking about where topic sentences come in, where your hypothesis is, what's underlined, you're actually going to get not discussed, not reviewed to begin with. So all of that hard work will basically be for naught. A lot of the grants that you may apply for as a student, as a resident, again, that may be offered by your med school or your regional society, will have somewhat more loose submission guidelines, and they will be a lot shorter. So again, formatting a specific aims page is something that takes a fair amount of skill, but being able to do kind of a more relaxed version that's a lot shorter will get you primed to when you actually may be applying for a much bigger grant. Similarly, one of the things that you really should be looking for with your mentors is if you go and submit that first manuscript, that second manuscript, if and when you get asked for revisions, your mentor should be going over every single point with you. The responsibility of making these revisions or suggesting them, again, it's sometimes a little bit more of a formal process. There is a certain amount of kind of polite genuflection that you need to do that just kind of serves as like a hidden handshake of how you're writing the reviews and how you're writing responses to those. Again, it may sound really silly, but somebody may have made some totally boneheaded criticism of your article that completely missed the point. However, 9 times out of 10, it's in your best interest to say, thank you for bringing up this point. It's very interesting, and I can see how you would come to that understanding. Maybe we didn't do the best job of clarifying. It's actually this way. We have changed, and you've changed like 2 words. But you've actually kind of acknowledged, 1, the reviewer is taking a fair amount of time, usually voluntarily, to do it, and 2, that you are responsive to that criticism, even if you're really not. And there are constant steps along each part of the research process that really, sometimes it just takes that experience to get. And again, that's one of the ways in which kind of starting smaller and leaning on your mentors can really help. Finally, again, the number of times where a resident or even people who are at the faculty level aren't really aware of some of the resources available will astonish you. In terms of librarians, if you're at a residency with an affiliated medical school, which is many but not necessarily all residencies, these are people who are literally paid to help you do research. They are often incredibly knowledgeable, and again, unless you've had a prior career in like health sciences research or public health, they are going to know the ins and outs of mesh, of all of the existing systems much better than you will. So honestly, for many of our trainees, the first step that we have them do is actually to just meet with the librarian, to basically say, hey, we're doing this topic in operations or informatics or whatever the mentee is working on with their mentor, and basically say, hey, in order to get yourself up to speed on this topic, and in order for us to help fill out this bibliography and really get the background piece of what we're writing, please meet with the librarian, come up with a structured search, and go with it. And again, 9 times out of 10, that actually ends up generating enough material that the resident has a review paper ready to go right afterward.
And I'll just top that off by saying that, coming with information ready. So I think if you come to a meeting with a mentor with, this is the idea I want to do, these are the background articles I found on it, or even this is the intro I've written on it, that goes a long way to show kind of your interest in the topic too. So.
If there is kind of like a process that tends to work for most residents as they go through, what tends to happen is, there are some limitations in terms of who's at your institution, what their interests may be, but the most productive times that I see residents go through research is there is something about the care that they're delivering that bugs them. It's kind of like, why are we doing this? Why are we ordering a UA on this patient? You know, why are we getting an X-ray on this patient? Is this actually affecting my practice? Because again, you know, all of us, I think, who are here want to in some way be involved in research. You're required to have some participation in research just to make it through residency. But I can tell you, working on a research project that doesn't interest you is probably worse for some people than doing disimpactions day in and day out. It's really boring. But ultimately, you start with a question that affects what you do and that kind of is inspired by your own practice. Then you're basically often looking just either retrospectively or just doing a literature review. And from that, you kind of maybe see a part of it that somebody else has not seen. You then just kind of move the needle a little bit. Maybe you are just trying to, again, control for who do we get a UA on, who do we not get a UA on, who do we get an X-ray on, who do we not get an X-ray on. And then maybe by your second year, by your third year, you're actually ready to propose that prospective study and to move it forward, because then that's kind of often what takes you from being a mentee to somebody who's more of a colleague, somebody who you're still getting advice for, but you're fundamentally moving on your own.
And I think that goes back to clarifying those expectations up front too, right? Like if you're like, I just want to write my case report and be done with my research requirement, I think that's very different than someone who's like, no, this kind of interests me, this is what I want to do. I think people will take that to heart a little bit more. So, anyone have any closing questions? All right, well, thank you all for the time. This is the AAMC paper is up top there. Obstacles to residents conducting research and predictors of publication if you're interested. Thank you all for your time. Enjoy the rest of the conference.